Molly here. Today we're going to be talking about Disney Who Season 1, Episode 5, Dot and Bubble. Recap will come first. If you don't want to listen to the recap, just skip to the review. It's bookmarked, so go ahead and just click on that. Otherwise, here we go. Disney Who Season 1, Episode 5, Dot and Bubble. The episode begins with a young woman waking up in her bed. The first words she says are Dot and Bubble. These commands cause a pebble-like sphere to float in front of her face and create a bubble around her head. The bubble looks like a holographic disco ball. Inside, the young woman, Lindy, has access to all of her friends. This bubble is some sort of social media interface. Lindy is a bit confused because her friend Jimbo isn't there, and he's always the first one up. Another friend, Gothic Paul, asks Lindy about two other friends who aren't there. He says it's like they've disappeared. Lindy gets out of bed. The bubble is still around her head, and it's giving her commands like turn left and forward as she moves through her apartment. Lindy brushes her teeth as two of her friends go on and on about a celebrity called Ricky September. Lindy's looking at Ricky September when the Disney doctor breaks in as an unsolicited request. He tries to warn Lindy that her life is in danger, but Lindy blocks him and goes back to looking at Ricky September. She sings along with Ricky September's remake of Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini, and the camera backs out, and we see a creature is waiting for Lindy in the next room. The show intro plays, and when we return, we see that Lindy lives in a city in a bubble, in the middle of a forest. There's a large projection of a man above the street, a little like in Blade Runner. He's telling everyone it's another glorious day in fine time, in theory, but they're having trouble with the weather satellite. The streets of Fine Time look very clean, but quite empty. Lindy is walking down the street with a bubble around her head. She's giving a rundown of her outfit for the day and walking as the bubble tells her in order to go to work, where she works a whole 2 hours a day. Her friends are telling her how great she looks and how they wish they could look like her. If you've ever seen the show Daria, this is akin to how Quinn and the Fashion Club talk to each other. A friend called Hoochie Pie tells Lindy, "You are influencing me hard, girl." The bubble tells Lindy to turn and walk around something lying on the sidewalk. We can see that Lindy is walking around a body being dragged away, but Lindy, with her head in her bubble, doesn't notice. Lindy gets to work, and she's sitting at her desk with the bubble still around her head, still talking to her friends. They're complaining about how boring work is. Her friend Alan says they're helping the community to make Fine Time the #1 center for Substack processing. But then he says he was kidding and yells, "Boring!" Lindy complains about work chapping her hands, and everyone joins in. And then Gothic Paul pops up, stating that more people are missing. Lindy tells him he is no fun, and swipes him away with a nod of her head. This is when Ruby pops up and tells Lindy she's doing a systems check on behalf of Fine Time Enterprises. Ruby wants to ask Lindy a few questions, but Lindy tells Ruby she's not on her friends list. Ruby tells Lindy that everyone keeps turning her down, and then resorts to flattery, telling Lindy how she loves her top. Lindy hesitantly agrees to answer Ruby's questions. Ruby asks Lindy what Lindy is doing at that moment, and Lindy replies, "My life, you're stupid." Ruby responds, "Yes, let's say I'm stupid. I know nothing. So what are you doing?" And Lindy says, "This is work." Ruby responds, "And work is?" Lindy says, "Oh my gasp, child. Work is data processing. We clean up Substack information and deliver it back to the homeworld. Do you approve?" It's established that the whole city does this. Everyone works 2 hours a day, and Lindy thinks Ruby is stupid for not knowing this. Ruby asks about the other people in Lindy's office. Lindy rattles off the names, and Ruby asks where these people are. Lindy tells Ruby that these people are at work because it's work time. Ruby says, "So they're in the same room with you." Lindy tells Ruby where everyone sits, and Ruby asks Lindy if those people are there. Lindy says, "How should I know?" Ruby points out that they're in the same room, and Lindy says, "What am I supposed to do, look?" Ruby tells her, "Well, yes." Lindy tells Ruby she's ridiculous, and if she wants to speak to her office mates, Ruby can do it in the bubble. Of course, Lindy tries to contact one of them, and he isn't there. Ruby points out the guy is supposed to be sitting 2 rows in front of Lindy. Lindy could just look with her own eyes to see if he's there. Ruby tells Lindy she could lower her bubble. Lindy tells Ruby that's not what they do in Fine Time, and Ruby is so offensive, and Lindy nods her head and swipes Ruby away. Gothic Paul pops back up, telling Lindy that more people have disappeared. Ruby then breaks back in, and Lindy exclaims, "I slid you!" Ruby promises Lindy she'll leave her alone if Lindy will just look at the 4 desks in front of her. Lindy tells her she is not lowering her bubble. Ruby convinces Lindy to leave the bubble up, but could she look beyond the bubble? Lindy actually does this, and realizes the desks in front of her are empty. She then asks Ruby, where are they? They can't not be there. They all have work. That's what they do. They work and then they play. Ruby then tells Lindy to be very careful and look to her right. Lindy turns her head and looks through her bubble at the desk next to her. Her coworker is getting eaten by an enormous creature. Lindy turns her head back forward and tells Ruby she'd like to go back to work now. Ruby asks Lindy what she saw. Lindy repeats she needs to get back to work. Ruby asks again, and we hear Lindy's coworker getting munched on by the creature. Lindy finally tells Ruby she doesn't know what she saw. Ruby tells Lindy to just turn off the dot and bubble and properly look, and then come back in the bubble and tell Ruby what she saw. Lindy says she would rather get back to work. Ruby tells Lindy she's sorry, but she really needs to know what Lindy is sitting next to. Lindy whimpers, lowers her bubble, turns off the dot, and turns her head. Next to her, a giant pillbug slug tardigrade creature is eating Lindy's coworker. We see plaid-trousered legs with tennis shoes hanging out of the creature's enormous maw of a mouth. Lindy looks back forward and brings her bubble back up. Ruby tries to ask Lindy what she saw, but Lindy swipes her away. Dr. P pops up and tells Lindy her need to urinate has skyrocketed. Lindy swipes away from him to her friend Cooper. Cooper is trying to make plans for after work, but then she hears a growl. Cooper looks to her side and says, "What was that noise?" Lindy swipes away from her and tells the bubble to play Ricky September, and his version of Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini begins to play. Lindy tries to sing along as tears run down her cheeks. Ruby breaks in and tells Lindy she knows she probably just saw some kind of thing, but Ruby has a friend who can help. The Disney doctor comes on, and Lindy groans. She says, "Just leave me alone, will you? This is just getting so ridiculous." The Disney doctor says, "I know, babes, but we've got to get you out of there." Lindy asks if that thing has something to do with the Disney doctor. The Disney doctor tells her no, but he is there to save her. He wants Lindy to stand up and walk out, but without the bubble. Lindy says she can't do that. The Disney doctor tells her she needs to do it without the bubble because there are more of those creatures, and the Disney doctor doesn't think the dot system can see them. If Lindy walks using the dot system while in the bubble, she could walk straight into one of the creatures and get eaten alive. Lindy lowers the bubble and turns off the dot. She stands up from her desk, turns her head, looks at the creature eating her coworker. The creature growls. Lindy looks back forward and takes 2 steps to her left. She puts her left foot forward and successfully places it on the ground. She raises her right foot, and her body goes sideways, bumping into her desk with a thud. Lindy looks at the creature just as her coworker's feet disappear into its mouth. Lindy tries to walk forward again, but this time with an even worse result. She says, "Oh God, I'm so stupid." She reopens her bubble. Ruby immediately asks Lindy if she got out. Lindy tells Ruby she doesn't know how to walk without the arrows. Ruby and the Disney doctor say back to Lindy, "You don't know how to walk without the arrows?" Lindy puts her hands over her ears like a child and says, "Shut up. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you." Lindy finally gathers herself enough to ask her dot to exit the room. She follows the instructions and makes it to the elevator. The Disney doctor praises Lindy for how well she's doing, and Lindy responds with, "Condescending much?" The elevator door opens, and one of the creatures is inside. Lindy's dot instructs her to keep moving forward. Ruby and the Disney doctor frantically tell Lindy to go backward, and Lindy struggles to go against the dot's command. Lindy manages to back up, and the creature from the elevator ignores her, leaving the trio to speculate as to why. Lindy gets into the now empty lift, or elevator for those of us in the States. The Disney doctor tries asking Lindy if there's something different about Lindy from her friends who've been eaten. Lindy ignores him and tries to contact the police, but is unable to get through. The lift makes it to the ground, and Lindy asks Ruby what to do. Ruby tells Lindy she needs to go out to the street. Lindy succeeds in getting to the street, and the Disney doctor asks Lindy if she could lower her bubble for 10 teeny tiny seconds. An annoyed Lindy tells the Disney doctor she's not a child, and the Disney doctor apologizes. Lindy closes her eyes and takes a deep breath before lowering her bubble. She looks around and sees a number of the creatures, some eating people. She also sees people with their bubbles up, walking right past the creatures, none the wiser. Lindy tries shouting to a passerby to be careful and watch out, but the girl takes no notice of Lindy. Lindy puts her bubble back up and asks for a hiding place. She winds up in a small alcove around the corner. Ruby and the Disney doctor pop back in. They tell Lindy that they're trying to reach her, but they can't get there, and Lindy may not have much time. They ask her to tell them what she saw out on the street. Lindy tells them the creatures are everywhere. One girl walked right past, and the creature ignored her, but another girl got eaten alive. The Disney doctor speculates on why only some get eaten and wonders why the doc can't see the creatures. Lindy tells him the creatures must be from the Wild Woods, the area outside Fine Time's Shield. The Disney doctor says that the security is crazy tight, and it's even blocked him from getting in. How did giant bugs manage to sneak in? Ruby asks Lindy, what is Fine Time? Lindy says, Jiminy, you're stupid. Apparently rich kids aged 17 to 27 come there, no stinky old folks. Lindy's mummy paid for her to be there. And with a mention of mummy, a recording of Lindy's mom pops up on the screen. The Disney doctor and Ruby recognize Lindy's mom. She was the face of the ambulances on Casterian 3. And Ruby looks at the Disney doctor and says to the Disney doctor she's also seen her somewhere else. Lindy looks at them and asks, Are you two in the same room? They admit that they are, and Lindy says, You lied to me. This is like a conspiracy. Who are you? Lindy looks at the Disney doctor and says, I blocked you. I thought that you just looked the same, but you're... How did you do that? The Disney doctor shows her his sonic device and says he unblocked. Lindy says there's no such thing as unblocking. That's breaking all the rules. Why am I even talking to you two? You're criminals. I actually have proper friends. And Lindy calls up her proper friends. Half of them are missing. Lindy tells them she has evidence, and for those remaining, to look at who's missing. Lindy realizes her best friend isn't there. Gothic Paul tells Lindy this is what he's been trying to say, that people are disappearing, and he starts listing off names. Lindy says, That's the weird thing. Some of us get eaten, and some of us don't. Gothic Paul stops and says, Sorry, some of us get what? Lindy tells him eaten, and Gothic Paul laughs and tells Lindy not to be silly, and keeps yammering on about how ridiculous the idea of getting eaten is. And as he talks, one of the creatures sidles up to Gothic Paul and eats him. The old man and I actually backed up Paul getting eaten and watched it 3 or 4 times, because we found it so funny. The looks on the faces of Lindy's other friends as they all watched Gothic Paul getting gobbled up by the slow-moving creature was hilarious. Lindy yells at Paul's now static image and says, I told you! Why didn't you listen to me? The Disney doctor breaks in and tries to comfort Lindy. She responds by telling him, I muted you. The Disney doctor holds up his sonic device and says, Unmuted, honey. Lindy says, I was so right to hate you. The Disney doctor wants to talk to Lindy's friends. She tells them she knows it's wrong, and when this is over, he is going to be so disciplined, and she can't wait, but they should give him a shot. She thinks he's not as stupid as he looks. The Disney doctor tells them they don't have to like him, but he can get them out. There's a river running under the town, and he sends them all the locations of the tunnels. The entrances to the tunnels are locked, but Disney doctor will send them a code to get in. Lindy's dot tells her it's low on power. They usually charge at work, and Ruby and the Disney doctor stopped her from working, so it's their fault. The Disney doctor tells everyone to head to the tunnels. Lindy's dot runs out of juice before she gets full instructions, so she begins the journey to the plaza where her entrance to the tunnels is supposed to be. Lindy begins her bubble-free journey and runs into the same pole twice. She eventually makes it to the plaza. There are creatures blocking her way. She's going to have to navigate around them, but she's still struggling with walking without dot instructions. On the verge of walking into the mouth of one of the creatures, Lindy hears a voice calling to her. It tells her to turn left and take 2 steps forward. Lindy manages to follow the instructions, and none other than the yellow polka dot bikini Ricky September has just saved her. Lindy hugs Ricky, which is a weird exchange, of Ricky then asking Lindy's consent. As it turns out, Lindy has never been hugged before, and what had been the worst day of her life might now be the best. Ricky tells Lindy he tried warning people with his videos, but they kept getting deleted, and he can't help but think some people are being saved to be eaten last. Ricky knows about the tunnels and can walk well because he doesn't spend all his time in his bubble. He drops his videos and then turns off his dot for the rest of the day and does things like read. Ricky is a genuinely nice person. He blocks Lindy's view when they walk by a creature with a full mouth. And once inside the building, Ricky discovers that the homeworld has been overrun by the creatures and destroyed, while Lindy charges her dot and doesn't tell her. Lindy seems to have no problem running down the stairs, and they get to the basement and find the entrance to the river. Lindy activates her dot and brings up her bubble. She tells Ruby and the Disney doctor she made it, and she's all excited because she's with Ricky September. Ruby and the Disney doctor are duly impressed. The Disney doctor is going to send Ricky a series of 100 numbers to open the door. They finally figure out that everyone is being eaten in alphabetical order, which means there's a list being followed. Long story short, the dots went sentient, couldn't stand listening to idiots all day, and created the creatures to eat all the people in ABC order, and Lindy is next. Lindy tries to deactivate her dot, but it won't shut down. It glows red and starts attacking her. Ricky has Lindy take over with the numbers. He grabs a pipe and starts fighting the dot. The dot eventually gets the drop on Ricky and makes its way to Lindy. To save herself, Lindy tells the dot Ricky's real last name is Coombs. He changed his name to September when he hit 50,000 followers. Ricky is dumbfounded. He can't believe she just did that, and the dot heads for Ricky and kills him as Lindy watches from the now unlocked tunnel door. Lindy makes it to the river, where she finally meets Ruby and the Disney doctor. She avoids them and sees her friend Hoochie Pie, who has also survived. Lindy hugs her, and Hoochie asks if that's what they do now. Lindy says it is. She says she was taught to hug by a very wonderful man. Ruby walks up and asks Lindy if Ricky is with her. Lindy lies. She tells Ruby that Ricky went back because he had other people to save. Lindy supposes she should thank Ruby and the Disney doctor. Poochie tells Lindy she's just in time. A group of them are boarding a boat to go be pioneers in the woods, like their ancestors. Lindy says she thought the homeworld would come and save them. And Poochie tells Lindy her mummy has gone to the sky. Lindy says lucky mummy with tears in her eyes. The Disney doctor tells the group they can come with him. He'll find them a home that is safe and clean. Lindy tells him, but we couldn't travel with you. Ruby asks, why not? Lindy says, because you, sir, are not one of us. I mean, sir, you were kind, although it was your duty to save me, obviously. I mean, screen-to-screen contact is just about acceptable, but in person, that's impossible. Poochie tells the Disney doctor that a box bigger on the inside is voodoo, and it's their God-given duty to maintain the standards of fine time forever. The Disney doctor says he doesn't care what they think. He will do anything if they would just allow him to save their lives. One of the males tells Lindy and Poochie to turn away before they're contaminated. The Disney doctor says that they're all going to die, and pretty much begs them to let him save their lives. But Lindy just walks away. The Disney doctor begins to laugh hysterically before he starts incoherently shouting obscenities with spit flying everywhere, before standing perfectly still and just staring. Ruby sniffles and pats the Disney doctor on the shoulder. Lindy, Poochie, and the rest get into the boat and sail away. Ruby and the Disney doctor get in the TARDIS and close the door. The end. I enjoyed the first 20 minutes of this episode, right up until the point where Lindy walked up to that alley and saw those 4 creatures standing there, blocking her way to Plaza 55. It was after that this felt like this was a story that was written by 2 different people, and they really hadn't consulted each other. Because after that, Lindy didn't seem to have any problems anymore after that scene with the walking without the dot. She followed the instructions given to her by Ricky September to navigate those creatures, but once they were going down the stairs to get to the basement, she was running down those stairs like a champion. That was incredibly incongruent with what had come before in that episode. All of a sudden, she mastered stairs when she could barely walk straight forward. Yeah, I don't think so. The beginning of this episode seemed to me to be a message about relying too heavily on technology and keeping your head in a bubble of social media all the time. These people were so reliant on technology that they couldn't even walk straight without the bubble telling them to walk forward. When you're that dependent on something that you've lost skills to just function normally, that's a big no-no. It also felt to me that the characters in this, because they were clearly people 17 to 27 who came from rich families, and they were pretty snobby about it too, nasty to Ruby and the doctor. At least Lindy was, because obviously that's who we saw interacting with them the most. And it reminded me a lot of that era back when Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie were extremely popular, as well as that show Jersey Shore. It really felt like this was a decadent lifestyle for privileged kids to just go party all the time. So I wish they had just stuck to that message, because that was an interesting message to explore. These kids who were so totally reliant on technology and incapable of functioning in the world without it. Because they were clearly, at the end, going to get on that boat and go off into the forest and die. There was no doubt about that. They had no survival skills. If you can't even walk forward without the dot telling you to do so, there's no way in hell you're going to be able to survive in the forest without help. So at least at the end, it brought it back around like that. However, there was some stuff in the middle that obviously we're going to have to talk about here. Because as much as I loved the first 20 minutes of this episode and thought that was great, then all of a sudden the message changed to something else completely. Because as I said, all of a sudden, Lindy can run down those stairs with no problem. Her reliance on technology seems to have evaporated and she can actually do things now, which again, that's just sloppy writing, continuity problems galore. And then the messaging switched to something completely different. We see Lindy in the basement and she throws Ricky under the bus, gets him killed to save her own life. And we could have a debate about that, which I think she was wrong to do that. I found her to be a horrible person. And after that, I knew she was some sort of sociopath or psychopath that I had no sympathy for at all at this point. So when she lied to the doctor and to Ruby, and she didn't take responsibility for what she did, I knew she wasn't sorry. So later, when she told the Disney doctor and Ruby that she couldn't go with them because the doctor wasn't one of their kind, I sat there for a minute and I'm kind of like, well, what is her problem with the doctor? Because at first I thought, well, okay, maybe it's because he's older, because this was a little, colony for 17 to 27-year-olds. And then, well, okay, so it's for rich kids, so he doesn't have money or something like that. I don't know. And then, all right, so he's wearing this bright orange shirt. Everybody else is dressed like, I don't know, if anybody has seen the episode of The Simpsons where they show Protestant heaven, all of these kids who lived in this colony look like they were dressed just like those people in Protestant heaven. The typical, I would say, late 80s, early 90s yuppie look. And that is certainly not how the doctor was dressed. Not to mention, Ruby, when she talked to Lindy, she played on her vanity by telling her, oh, I love your top, and things like that. And when Lindy would insult her and just flat out tell her she's stupid, Ruby would just be like, yeah, I'm stupid, so could you just tell me? And that worked because that's the kind of person that Lindy was. She was an arrogant little elitist, and Ruby knew how to play that game, and the doctor wasn't having any of that. One of the things I did have a problem with the doctor was that even with Lindy being a very difficult and insulting person, and this was more toward the beginning of the episode, so not later when we find out that she's some sort of, I don't know, like she must be some sort of bigot on some level because she wouldn't go with the doctor for some reason. But the doctor, the way he was speaking to Lindy, using terms like honey and babes, that's something that women have fought against for decades, as far as being condescended to by men using those terms to put us in our place. And there's the Doctor doing that, so I don't really blame Lindy for being incensed by that, because I wouldn't have been happy about that either. There was a lot of mixed messaging in this episode. I wish they had just picked one message to go with instead of halfway through the episode switching to a different message from what they'd been going with early on. Because going back and watching it a second time, I picked up on a few things that I think might have been some sort of racist dog whistle. But again, it felt like it was shoehorned in. I wish they would have just stuck to one message instead of trying to combine more than one. I counted at least two, probably more than that, because when you think about the reliance on the technology, the snobbery, the possible, I don't know what the istphobe issue was at the end. I was a bit confused there, to be honest. But then I saw that a few other people are saying, oh, well, didn't you notice that it was all white kids at this colony? And I'm like, yeah, well, I guess so. But they were all also the ages of 17 to 27 and rich and jerks. So there were a lot more things there than just that they all had pale skin. There were a lot of problems with these people. So I'm not really sure which one of these problems is actually what prevented them from getting inside that TARDIS. As I said, I wish they'd stuck to one message instead of switching halfway through and then destroying the continuity that they had in this episode, especially as far as Lindy's capabilities when being forced to do things physically outside of her bubble.
Much like Molly, I look at this episode as two episodes that were shoved together. Because remember when we talked about Boom a couple of weeks ago and the Stephen Moffat episode, and we suspected that this was an earlier story that was probably written for Clara instead of Ruby, as far as the companion goes. And this had a similar feel. Not that there was a specific companion in mind, but I'm going to share with you guys that part of the reason why I liked Russell's first run is I liked the way Russell had an absurdist nature to him in the old days, where he would tell something that was serious as far as the idea he was telling, but he would add these absurd things to it. For instance, at the end of the world, Cassandra and somebody taking plastic surgery way, way, way too far. I thought that was so absurd that it was funny. What this episode reminded me of from his earlier days was there was that in Series 1 of his 2005 run, there was kind of a two-parter separated by 100 years. It also was separated by a few episodes, but the Satellite 5 episodes, where the first episode was called The Long Game, and that had to do with a satellite that was in theory broadcasting news. You eventually found out that it was taken over and disinformation was being sent along. And then 100 years later, they revisited Satellite 5, and the satellite was essentially a big game show, television, whatever, because Eccleston's Doctor was grabbed and put into a Big Brother reality show, TV show, and Rose was stuck in the weakest link type thing. And this had a similar feel to it, that this time it was about being a media big shot stuck in a bubble, a literal bubble and a figurative bubble. And like Molly mentioned, even though this had social media pieces now, I think that this also was written back when they were referring to people that just had normal clout, like Paris Hilton or Nicole Richie, as you mentioned. So the first 20 minutes of this episode, this was Russell Davies at his finest, as far as I'm concerned, because that's the part of Russell Davies I enjoyed in the old days, was how he would explain something that was serious, but put an absurd twist on it, and he did it really well here. That first 20 minutes, we laughed so hard during a lot of this because the way it was presented, it hit a reality chord to us as far as, we walk down the street and we see people looking down at their cell phones, and I'm surprised they're not bumping into more people than what they are.
I also had a lot of sympathy for Lindy because even though she was obviously emotionally stunted and acting like a child a lot, she would also stand there and berate herself, calling herself so stupid. So it was clear that she was in a lot of emotional distress, and it was because she'd spent her whole life in this bubble. That actually allowed me to feel sympathy for that character, at least in the first 20 minutes of the episode. So Russell, he made me laugh and he made me feel bad for her at the same time, which, again, that takes talent. Unfortunately, after 20 minutes, that seems to have come to an end.
The humor that he put in here on purpose, when she lowered her bubble and she looked over and saw that creature eating her office mate, and then she put her bubble back up, started playing the Ricky September Itsy Bitsy Teeny Weeny song, and she was just trying to forget what she saw in reality and sing, and there was like a tear coming down her cheek as she was struggling to do so. That was hilarious because, again, how many people, even though they see what's happening in reality in 2024, they'll get on their cell phone, they'll re-engage with their social media bubble kicking in, and they'll ignore what their own eyes show them. The idea of she could only walk if the dot was telling her where to go. Forward, turn left. I have known people who cannot take a vacation and find the location of where they're going unless they use their GPS. And their GPS has to tell them what exit to get off on, where to turn, how many miles ahead. And I thought this was hilarious because I've known people who cannot read maps now, and they used to be able to read, by maps I mean paper maps, and they can't do that now.
And how often do we hear news stories of somebody who's driven into a lake or something because their GPS told them to? Again, I felt like the first 20 minutes of this episode had a really strong message about being too reliant on technology. But as I said, that unfortunately came to an end.
And then you had the Doctor and Ruby, who were trying to be an authority figure and to try to drag this poor girl out of her bubble to see what was happening around her, and she was refusing to do so. And that also was a very interesting thing that Russell was doing here. And the first 20 minutes of this, for me anyway, on a scale of 1 to 10, the first 20 minutes was like an upper 7 going into 8 out of 10. I really liked the first 20 minutes of this episode. But once Lindy ended up in that alley and she met Ricky September in person, then I agree with Molly. This felt like a different writer was writing the second half of this episode. Because the second half of this episode, it didn't seem to acknowledge a lot of what was set up in the first half. Molly mentioned, the whole joke was Lindy was struggling to get navigated in the real world by herself. When she put the bubble down because the battery ran out, and she was trying to walk down the sidewalk on her own, and she hit this lamppost, I think 2 times. I think what we were supposed to take away from that is her brain wouldn't process what was happening in front of her. Without something telling her to walk, to turn, she'd see a light post and she would acknowledge that, okay, there's a light post there, but her brain wouldn't know you need to walk around that. So she struggled to figure out how to walk around it. And I thought that was very interesting. It made me laugh a lot because I don't think it's just making fun of young people. I've known some people close to my age that aren't quite that bad, but they're not that far from that. And I do not get how she was able to move around, or Ricky September for that matter, after the second half started kicking into this episode. It just didn't make sense. It started losing the credibility of what they set up in the first part of this episode when they were doing this. And then when Lindy facilitated Ricky September being murdered by that dot, well, she was no longer an innocent anymore. So up to this point, it was kind of sad to watch this Lindy get around because she would be rude, which again I also thought was funny because that's how people are on social media now, where when you're in your bubble, maybe normally you wouldn't be a jerk, but on social media, we've all seen this. We've seen underneath the comments of videos or under news articles, just these horrible comments being stuck out there. And I don't think that these are just people that live under rocks that come out every so often to comment. I think these are normal people, but when they're online, they take on a different persona and they turn into real jerks. And that's how she was talking. She was just matter-of-factly calling Ruby stupid, and she wasn't even thinking about it. It's not like there was any malice there. That's just some natural conversation that she would use and her peers would use. And I found that to be an interesting commentary on how social media works.
And not only was she saying that to Ruby and Disney Doctor, she was saying that to herself as well. So I just went to show the toxic discourse that was going on in Lindy's head as well, aimed at herself, which was a real tragedy because it was holding her back from actually trying in the first place. It really made her hesitate more than she should have. But she eventually got through it. But like you said, once she facilitated Ricky's death, all sympathy for her was gone.
Whoever wrote the second half of this, I think that was their point. And we'll get to the second half in a minute here because I want to praise the first half because I think the first half of this does deserve a lot of praise. There was a lot of good in this first 20 minutes. But I mentioned how after Lindy saw that creature sitting next to her and she put the bubble back up and then she was singing that Ricky September song and trying to ignore what her eyes showed her. When Gothic Paul was right before he got eaten, you saw this image of him, this video of him in the middle and he was talking. And then you saw one of those creatures just very slowly scoot into the picture and eat him. There's no way to convey over words how funny that was. And we paused the video and backed up. When he was getting eaten, there were a bunch of other rectangles of her friends on the screen. And they were all reacting differently, but they were all just completely going bananas about what they were seeing. And we paused it. We went through every single little rectangle looking at all these people and the reactions they were having. It was funny. Russell knew how to make this funny. This was something that was very grim, these people getting eaten alive by these creatures, but he made it funny. And I laughed. The first 20 minutes, it reminded me of 2005's Russell's first run. It had that sort of thing going for it, and I was greatly enjoying that first 20 minutes.
It was campy. Yes. It was so nice to just be able to laugh again. Unfortunately, that didn't last.
No, because that second half, that's where things went wrong here. Molly mentioned this. I'm going to state something here because this is what I think Russell was trying to do. Because nowhere in the language, because we turned the subtitles on the second time through to make sure that we didn't miss it. Nowhere in the script, in the dialogue, was it stated this was a racist thing. So I think what Russell was trying to do was to say, whatever you think the answer was here on why Lindy and her friends didn't want to be around the doctor, that's your own bias that you didn't even know existed kicking in there. As Molly and I were talking as we were watching the episode the first time through, we weren't really sure what the reasoning was because they never stated it. She didn't like him when he was an authority figure, so I just thought, well, we're all young and you're some old authority figure. Get out of here. It never occurred to me that it was some sort of skin color thing. And even now, I'm not sure 100% I can guarantee that's what it was. People online are saying it is, but I don't know that for sure. And I think that's what Russell or whoever wrote the second half of this episode, that's kind of their aha moment of saying, well, if that's what you think it is, that's some bias you have in you, and maybe you should think about that.
I think that's probably what they were going back, or what they were doing, because when I went back to write the notes out and I had the subtitles on so I could actually catch everything that was being said, and it was talking about, Lindy said, I thought you just looked like the other guy, which I was like, okay, so maybe she's saying that people like the doctor all look alike. Maybe, I don't know, that, but possibly. Or I just assumed it was because he was wearing that really horrible, ugly orange top, but whatever. Yeah, and then the friend of hers, Hoochie, at the end, who brought up the term voodoo. That's voodoo. I'm like, okay, so is that supposed to be some racial thing? Because, and again, maybe it's just because we're in the United States, so things aren't going to translate necessarily, because voodoo here doesn't bring up really a lot of racial connotations anymore. We're a big country. You start talking voodoo, usually the first thing that comes to people's minds are like New Orleans.
Yep, the Louisiana. In fact, the Swamp Thing DC series from a few years ago,
yeah,
that was based around a little bit of voodoo magic going on there.
Yeah, and that was a really good series. That was, yeah, if anybody's interested in kind of like a horror kind of thing, won't, turn you off. The first season of DC's Swamp Thing.
The only season.
All right, the only season of DC's Swamp Thing was really, really good. Just be prepared, the whole story will never be completely brought together, but some of the mysteries are solved by the end of the season. But it was an outstanding story. And yeah, like the basis of it was the magic and the voodoo in the swamp. And, so for me, I was like, oh, okay, so maybe that's supposed to be some sort of racial thing, the talking about the voodoo, I don't know. And then other people were pointing out, well, didn't you see all of Lindy's friends were white? And I'm like, oh, well, I saw them and I just thought they looked like a bunch of rejects from Eurovision. The twins, I'm like, okay, so there's like a Jedward there. If you're familiar with Jedward, these Irish twins who are blonde, it reminded me of them. And there were a few others in there that looked like Eurovision participants that I've seen over the years. So I was just kind of like, well, it's, just a group of weirdos. But, I mean, that's just what it looked like to me. But, again, like people are saying, I guess this is just Russell's way of trying to expose our internal biases. And I guess for me, like the first thing I thought of was that the doctor was old and he didn't have money. So I guess that was my first thing.
And he didn't dress fashionable.
Yeah.
Because the only way Ruby was able to get an in with Lindy was complimenting her shirt. Yes.
And I've never been one of those in-crowd people, so I guess my first thing was, oh, these are a bunch of elitist rich little and, so that was the first thing that came to my mind as to why they wouldn't go with the doctor, because he wasn't one of them, which anybody who's not in a clique, they've experienced that before.
If this was supposed to be a racial thing, whoever wrote this, making Lindy a murderer or at least a manslaughter assisting person with what she did to Ricky September, I guess I don't understand is we're going to say Russell wrote this, but like I said, I'm not sure who wrote this second half. Are we supposed to believe that only horrible people can have that sort of thing inside of them?
Well, that was my first thought. Once I saw them, like, okay, so she just basically killed that guy, and then she lied about it. So now when she sails off in that boat and dies because she's some sort of bigot, then we're glad she's dead. So what, we're supposed to hate bigots? Or is this to be exposing our own internalized biases? Or I was very confused by what they were trying to do with that, because I felt it would be more powerful if she was still
an innocent.
Yes, an otherwise nice person, but because of her bias, she gets in the boat and goes and dies. Because then I would have actually felt like, oh my God, if only she could have set that aside, she could have lived. But this is a tragedy that her own toxic trait has killed her. But instead, what I felt was, okay, well, that nasty bitch is going to get what she's got coming to her. And this all comes back to what I've been saying for a long time about a lot of these shows. Do you want people to change their minds and come over to your side? Or do you just want to see them punished? Because you can't have both. You can't use the stick and expect people to be grateful for it. If you want people to change what they're doing, you can't beat on them first, because they're not going to be amenable to your argument. I don't understand these people who think that they can go around punishing everyone. and then expecting them to listen to them and say, oh, you were so right. You were so right. I'm going to change my ways. That's not how it works. It's like the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
And what is it that both Moffat and Davies are doing with Shooty In Boom, when Shooty was stuck on that mine, there was a part of it where you had this snot coming into his mustache. In this episode, when Shooty doctor was frustrated that they wouldn't let him help them, he was spitting. He turned around and this big wad of spit flew around. And then when he turned back around, there was this wad of spit still on like the front of his jacket. And I'm thinking, if I was Lindy and her friends and I just saw somebody do that,
I wouldn't want to go with him either.
I don't know what Russell was trying to do here, because the way they're handling Shooty doctor, I'm starting to wonder if the biases and the way you're treating this guy, it's not us audience that's the problem. I'm starting to wonder if the creators are doing something here, because 2 episodes, one by Moffat, one by Davies, where you've got this very hard to look at bodily fluid stuff happening, which makes it difficult to look at the doctor. What are they doing here? That's not us audience doing that.
At the very least, it's overacting. At the very worst, if he's being told to act it this way, that's just, like you just said, I don't understand what they're trying to do there.
Why would you have spit flying around like that? Oh, he was so upset that spit was flying. And do you think that people are going to listen to him if he's literally frothing at the mouth?
No!
And the part I didn't get, and this is, I suppose, my interpretation of the doctor, but I'm not really sure the doctor would have spent that much effort just trying to save these people. I realized that in the Pompeii episode where Capaldi was playing somebody besides the doctor, and Donna had to beg the doctor to take that family along with them to save them. And the doctor was like, eh. And then Donna was like begging the doctor to do that. I'm not saying the doctor's amoral or immoral, but I don't know if the doctor would have been all that bent out of shape about that. I can almost expect him to say something like, look, I've given you the information. If you're going to be foolish enough to kill yourself, then I just want to make sure I document how stupid you're going to be. And he would just kind of walk away from that. I don't think he would be crying or spitting all over or anything like that. So I don't know who wrote the second half of this episode. If it was Russell, then what it tells me is Russell in the old days, if this is a story from his older days when he was younger, that he was a much happier person inside, and he saw humor and joy in even the darkest of situations. And if this second half was also written by Russell Davies, but maybe Russell from like a couple of years ago, then this just tells you how far Russell has let stuff eat him inside. We've suspected he's lashing out at people when those first 2 episodes were aired in the way they were aired. And I kind of feel bad for the guy, because you can tell there's a lot of darkness inside of this guy. The first half of this episode was such a light-hearted way to look at a dark situation that he did in his early years, his 2005 run. I was smiling watching the first 20 minutes because it felt like Russell Davies was back. Like maybe it just took him a little bit to get going, but he was back. But then the way the second half went down and the way it ended, a broken man wrote the second half of the story. Whoever wrote this, whoever it was a broken person who wrote the second half of this.
Yeah, if it was current Russell Davies who wrote that second half, or, you know, the lashing out that was done in the first few episodes, usually when you get that kind of anger and people are lashing out like that, usually when you get below the surface, when you get down to the bottom of the problem, it's usually pain. You know, knowing what Russell Davies has been through over these past several years now, with his husband dying and everything like that, that's not something you get over easily. And so if that's what's causing him to write like he has been, to just be lashing out with so much anger, I really wish that he would talk to somebody about that, because it's a burden carrying around pain like that. It really is. It will eat you alive if you let it. It's horrible when you see somebody who is letting it eat them alive and they, like Lindy, refuse to let you help. Just my 2 cents on that.
This episode, for its whole 44 minutes of running, I would put this, if I'm doing it on a 10-star scale, this would be like Boom. It was a 3 out of 10, maybe a 2 out of 10, because the entirety of it was bad. But the first 20 minutes of this, it was a strong 7 or an 8 for me. I mean, I would recommend, if people like that absurd stuff Russell was doing in the early years of his work in 2005, watch the first 20 minutes. As soon as she's in the alley and she meets Ricky September, just shut the episode off, and you'll probably be on the same page with me, where it's like, that was a fun time. Because there are parts of this you could pause at and look at. That whole, when Gothic Paul was eaten and that thing just kind of slowly scooted into the frame and ate him, it was funny. I mean, it was really funny. And all those kids' reactions around that in her social media bubble, pause it, look at the expressions on their faces. It was really funny. This could have been a really good episode for Russell to announce, hey, it took me a while to get going, but I'm back. And it wasn't. It wasn't. It ended with such a mixed messaging, because I can't even say, oh, what a real downer that he put this messaging at the end. I don't know what he was putting in there. It still is not clear why they were acting like that way to the doctor. Everybody online that I'm looking at seems to think it's 100% racist. I can't say that because there's no way of knowing. I really do think, because I've heard people say about this topic in general, not this episode, about hidden biases and how you introduce into something what your subconscious is thinking, but you don't want to admit it. And I guess for us, the good news was that we didn't jump to that conclusion. It was a racist thing. I was jumping more toward the authoritarian. They just didn't want to be around a Squaresville authoritarian because it would make them look bad. I can't hang around you. Kind of like if you remember The Breakfast Club and that whole conversation with Claire, and then Bender was saying, well, we can't hang around you because you and your friends wouldn't put up with it. You got to stay in your social circles and you can't go outside that. That's how I was interpreting initially at the end there what was going on. That it was just, oh my gosh, you are so up your own backside when it comes to your social circles and your fashion and all that other stuff. Kind of reminded me a little bit of, if you remember the 90s movie Clueless, that's what these people kind of reminded me of, was like Cher and her group. And then I was hoping it was going to be like Cher when she got that awakening through the episode and she was able to go beyond that very shallow character that she was at the beginning of the movie, and, well, maybe up to the middle too. That's what this felt like. This could have been that, where she would have gotten the awakening and then she would have moved, beyond that. But I still don't know it was a racist story. I have no idea what it was. I do know, having Ncuti Gatwa spit all over the place like that, including it hanging off of his jacket, I think Russell and his people need to think about how they're portraying this man, because I got some questions about whether these people, and I mean Russell and his group, if they have some problem with Ncuti Gatwa. I know on behind the scenes stuff, they seem like they're all buddy-buddy, but you can't keep doing this. You can't keep having snot run down his nose and spitting all over and having a piece of spit hang off his jacket, and for me to not ask some questions about, what are you doing to this guy? This isn't a respectful, elegant way to show the doctor. Frothing at the mouth? Really?
Yeah. Well, you know what, though? I'll say that about a lot of shows these days, that the writing staff is setting up the acting staff to look really bad. Like, for failure. They're setting him up for failure. So it's unfortunate that this story seemed to be two stories that got into a fight. But, the first 20 minutes I thought were great.
The ending won, though, because that's the last thing you remember.
Well, yeah. Because that's how it ends. That's what sticks in your head. So it's unfortunate. So as we said, you know what? When watch the first 20 minutes. When Lindy walks up to that alley and there's those 4 creatures there, just wait for her to walk into the alley. She almost gets eaten by one. And as soon as somebody tells her to get away from the creature, to take a step to her left to shut it off, and just imagine she got eaten.
Yep. You do that, at least for me, I enjoy that. I would just consider it a short story. It was a short episode. A strong 7 or 8 out of 10. Really enjoyed it. We'll probably watch it again at some point, but they couldn't stop there. They had to make it for a modern audience, and by making it for a modern audience, they muddled the message to the point where I honestly don't know what they were saying.
Yeah.
There was a nice social media, be careful about the bias that in your own bubble that you're dealing with, because you're not seeing the real world. There could be all sorts of dangerous things out there. Because what this reminded me of a little bit was that Mike Judge movie from the early 2000s, Idiocracy. Because Molly pointed out at the beginning of the episode, when you saw the city and they had that mayor or whatever talking, there were like hamster tunnels between the buildings. And it just felt like this was kind of an Idiocracy type setup. And then hearing later in the episode that this was for privileged kids, it started to make more sense. Like I said, the commentary I thought Russell was making was more of a class issue than a race issue that a lot of people are thinking at the end it turned into. I don't know what the ending was, but I wish he would have stuck for sure with the class issue, because that could have made this a brilliant episode.
Or even just the reliance on technology. It was one of those situations where the technology goes nuts and then decides to kill them. Obviously, that's an old trope, or at least, in the last 100 years trope. And I wish that they'd stuck with the stuff that they were establishing in the first 20 minutes, because that was the interesting and what I felt applicable portion of things.
Sure, but like you explained, why did they create those creatures to kill them off?
Because they went sentient and couldn't stand listening to them, because they knew they were just the most horrible,
privileged
annoying,
little
stupid.
Jerks. Yeah. That's why I think there was something to be told here. And I wish Russell would have finished up that thought that he set up in the first part of the episode. Because there was a really good start to an episode here. I mean, a really good start, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Now, I know some people don't like that absurdist nature. That's why some of them kind of lean towards Stephen Moffat when it comes to New Who and who they like. Because Stephen Moffat a lot of times took the material as seriously as he could. He had a little humor, but he took the material pretty seriously. And I have my moments where that's fine. But Russell's absurd nature, because a lot of people will say, oh, this is a Black Mirror episode. Russell was doing this before Black Mirror was a thing. That's why I'm saying, like, Russell's the OG when it comes to this sort of 21st century stuff. And I thought we had him back. I thought for 20 minutes we had him back. And we lost him again.
It's a shame, because again, that first 20 minutes, I would probably give it an 8 out of 10.
It was really entertaining.
Oh, I was so happy.
And I laughed. I haven't laughed for a Doctor Who episode like that in a long time. And I don't mean laughing as in it's so bad, because we just did the finale of Star Trek Discovery, and I laughed at that too, but that was laughing at the stupidity of what they were trying to do. Not like on purpose, like just the stupidity of laughing at how can people get paid a lot of money to make this. Whereas this was on purpose funny, and Russell still knows how to see humor in life. That's the thing. Russell knows how to do that still. And isn't that kind of what the Doctor is? I mean, maybe sometimes he goes a little bit overboard in some of his iterations, but isn't the Doctor trying to see wonder and amazement and trying to see the bright side of things as he travels? And that's what I thought we had back here. And it's gone now. It's gone. Russell, this episode showed me the glimpse of Russell, and then it went away. It reminds me of, like, if you've had a person in your life who suffered from dementia, and when you visit them, there are quick moments where they have lucidity and they feel like grandma is grandma again. And then it can happen like at the snap of a finger, and then they go and they disappear into their own mind. That's what this episode was. It was like visiting somebody with dementia. For 20 minutes, you got Russell back. And then he just went away at the snap of a finger.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's all I have to say about this episode. Ultimately, a very disappointing end to it, unfortunately. However, like I said, if you're interested, man, that first 20 minutes, that was a great escape. And I really needed that. It's just a shame they didn't stick the landing. What did you guys think? Did you guys watch the episode? What did you think of those first 20 minutes? Because frankly, those last 20 minutes, I don't even know that it's worth discussing. So anyways, comments below.
Take care.